Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha Benashuva Benashuva Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha Venashua Venashua Chadish Chadish Yamedu Kekeda Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Vena, Shuma, Vena, Shuma. All right, good evening, friends. Good to be here with all of you. So, as I mentioned in my email this earlier this afternoon, I did a little bit of Googling to see if there were any news stories of nations doing teshuvah, and I didn't find any. And in Rabbi Ruttenberg's book, she talks about some nations that have attempted to do teshuvah processes, most notably South Africa and its limited teshuvah and truth and reconciliation and its limitations, as well as Germany's attempts as a nation to do teshuvah for the Shoah. And she talks a great deal about the need for the US to do teshuvah for the harms of slavery, and to some extent for the theft of indigenous land. I didn't explicitly put out the call for stories of national teshuvah, but before we really dig in, I invite you all to share if any of you have a reflection that you want to share of other nations attempting to succeeding in or in some other way engaging with the task of teshuvah. Joy, go ahead.
Hello, hi everyone. So I wanted to talk a little further about Germany just because I have some German friends who are younger generation than me, and they have said, I think this is the good aspect of it, how much they truly learned about the Holocaust and the German role in it in school. So I think the younger generation, there really has been an effort for true education. And what goes through my mind reading these is okay, we can pass laws, but how do we make those deeper cultural changes? how do we have people really understand? And that is so difficult and complex. And so I think in that way, at least the younger people I've talked with, it seems to have been very successful. They don't feel defensive. To me, I was very impressed with how their education was on that. So
Right.
some of those more complex, how do you really shift how people think about it? I think that might be an example of some success with that.
Excellent. Yes, Julie.
Well, Joy, I just want to know, do you, how do you think that education happened that they would not feel guilty and then reject, out of that? I mean, how do you, that's what we're
Right.
struggling with, right? How do you make people not feel bad,
And close their minds and say,
Yeah.
I'm not racist. And yeah. Well, boy, that's a good question. Some of it was, I think, in the book. She talked about how the young activists pushed it and got it to the front of the agenda. Um, so that might be part of it. I don't know the answer, Julie, but that seemed like part of it. I don't know. What do you think? What do you all think?
Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book Past the Origin of Our Discontents, uses the metaphor of inheriting a house with rotting beams at the beginning of the book. And she says, look, it's not your fault if you own a house with rotting beams, but you still have to do something about it. Like, it's yours now. You didn't build the house, you didn't cause the rot, but it's yours now. And so anyone all the co-owners of this house have a vested interest and responsibility to make sure it doesn't cave in on itself, to make sure the rot is addressed before it caves in. And I remember being particularly struck by that metaphor because in the Talmud, there is also a discussion of a house that was built using stolen beams. And it's a very similar discussion about the responsibilities of the inheritors of that house and the question. And they sort of conclude that ideally, in an ideally just world, the inheritors would entirely dismantle the house in order to return the stolen beams. But in the world in which we live, that's too much of a barrier to teshuva. If a person felt like that was the only way to do teshuva, they would give up before they started. So it has to be acceptable for the inheritors of a house with a stolen beam to pay back the value of the money of the beam. And I think, and I just say that because I think this notion of inheritance, right? It's this thing that has come into our possession that we need to deal with, is a really useful thing because it both shows the closeness and the responsibility. We are close to and we are responsible for our inheritances. And there's like a moral clarity of what happened to get them to us is not our fault, but what we do with them going forward is absolutely our responsibility. That's just one thought. I mean, I think the language we use and the metaphors we use matter. Marlene?
I was in South Africa maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And what was interesting is that people recognized and took responsibility for the harm that had been done to Black people, and they were open about it. I tried to speak with as many people as I could about that, and I also visited, I'm forgetting what it was called, but it was sort of like some of the small segments of property where Black people lived in horribly small huts with bad, no real, no real toilets or even water coming out of spigots, was sometimes good, sometimes bad. But it was also a step beyond what had been happening, which was, outright slaughter. And it seemed like both sides accepted both the harms that were done and also acknowledge who was responsible for them. And that impressed me. It was like, okay, we figured this out and we're taking steps. We're not anywhere close to near yet, but we're on our way. And I think that responsibility, just nobody argued about whose fault it was or why it was so terrible or what kinds of things were done that were so unfair. And that impressed me. It seemed like a good number of steps in the right direction.
So what strikes me with both Germany and South Africa is how such horrible harms,
Mhm.
such horrible harms that were done and that then were acknowledged. And in the case of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation, amnesty was promised to people who came forward and told the truth, which removed some of the, right, it's like the Talmudic discussion about removing a barrier to teshuva, right? Like ideal justice would demand that people face consequences for the harms they perpetrated, but that might be too much of a barrier to teshuva. So it's like paying the money on the stolen beam. At least the truth got to be acknowledged. And in Germany, I wonder how much the truth telling was helped by the fact that so many of the victims were dead.
Mm.
And what would it mean, right? Germany didn't actually have to return millions of Jews to the homes from which they had been displaced. And I say that just because I think about all the cases where nations don't reckon with harms done. And I think even about things like land acknowledgements, which, to be honest, drive me nuts. I get so annoyed whenever I hope nobody sound bites me out of context, but I get so annoyed whenever I'm in a space in Oregon where people talk about how we're on Kalapuya territory, as if the saying of that statement is an act of repair in a meaningful way. And it's very easy for us to pretend that noting that we're on Kalapuya territory in some way remediates the harm. That we're taking a moment to feel bad about the fact that there used to be Kalapuya people here, but we killed all of them, and the few remaining descendants are now, I believe, part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and not even here anymore. So it's very convenient. We can do land acknowledgements to these people that we've entirely annihilated and displaced because they're not making any other claim on us. Or if we are, we're not even paying attention to what the claim is. Although I know back in December we did a a session on the cost of free land and heard from Seeding Justice a little bit about how they're actually trying to put some teeth on land acknowledgements with their land acknowledgement fund. But it does seem like there's a trend that we like to do teshuva when it is easy, when the victims are far away and they're not going to have an ongoing claim on us. Now, in cases like American racism or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there it's just a lot more loaded to even ask the question, who needs to do teshuva? For what? What does that look like? I'm gonna just pause because a bunch of things just came in the chat. Okay, a few of the Kalapuya are still here. I am not familiar with the dictionary. Maybe you can drop a link in the chat for us. So that's where I want us to focus some discussion time together. If you have access to the book, I want you to read the large paragraph that is on most of page 116. In the case of national repentance work, to the end of that paragraph. And she lays out a pretty useful, ideal framework for doing repentance work. But I want to ask the question, how does this get more complicated when not everyone agrees about what was done and whether it was harm? And when we don't all agree, or perhaps even a majority thinks that what has happened is already known and has been discussed enough, how do we get to a place of readiness for teshuva? I'm going to put those questions in the chat. And, oh, Sharon, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, as much as it seems onerous to keep hearing it, it does do something, which is make people aware. They cannot ignore it. And I think it was a big step where it's been part of the educational curriculum now. You know, you don't take giant steps. You're lucky if you can get baby steps. But that does raise consciousness. And anything that raises consciousness, no matter whether it doesn't accomplish everything we want, but it is a step. That's all.
When you're saying the it you're talking about is land acknowledgements, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I accept that correction. I think you're right. So you're pushing me to refine my critique. I accept that land acknowledgements as a step towards reparation are appropriate. And I think my critique is that I see a lot of land acknowledgements more as virtue signaling, as like, look, we are enlightened, as opposed to actually being framed as a step towards something beyond it. And I'll say, like, more explicitly, like, I would do a land acknowledgement if I were then going to say as part of it, like, and here is an effort to, like, and here's where you should donate to help the Kalapuya people with their effort to buy back their land, or like but I often feel like land acknowledgements don't have that next step of like where we are directing the that awareness to take us to. Ellen, was there a hand there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, yes, it can be extremely more than irritating to, it is virtue signaling in lots of cases, but there's a very robust conversation going on among, um, different tribal people about whether it's worthwhile or not. And some people say that it is just a pile of crap, it's just words. And other people say, like Sharon does, it is an opening, and it can lead to people really learning a lot more and taking action. There's videos about what makes a meaningful land acknowledgement, what doesn't. So yeah, it's complicated, but it's not just to totally write it off.
That's great. Ellen, if you have links to any of that, would you please either drop them in the chat or send a reply email to this group?
Okay,
You
or
don't have?
people can just Google YouTube land acknowledgement discussion.
Okay, it's on YouTube.
There are, yeah, but I'll look for some. Okay.
Awesome. All right, friends. So getting to the conversation about what happens when, how do we even get to a point of teshuvah when people don't agree on the narrative of what happened? People don't agree to talk about it. Um, you know, not just looking at the work that the youth in Germany did say, but like how did they even get to a point where they were willing to make those demands? But just I invite us to discuss. And I sent an email at about 4 p.m. this afternoon, so you may not have seen it, but it included a link to an article by Peter Beinart, which was from a few years ago, so it was before October 7th, on Teshuvah, Why Israel Owes Palestinians Reparations, which I wanted to send because I think it's I suspect that in our group, there may be a majority of people who think that the US needs to do teshuvah with Black people. There may be a majority of people in our group who think, or we may even be unanimous about it, that the US needs to do a teshuvah for slavery. But I actually think the really, so that in some ways is not a useful conversation for us to have, because if we all agree in the first place, then that's most of the work already done. Because the work is, what do we do when we have such vastly different narratives that we don't even agree? And I imagined there might be some of us in this group who would find that Peter Beinart article extremely difficult to read, who would be extremely resistant to reading it. And so, or who might even argue with his premises. And so I think those are actually this is life, right? This is the world. This is why teshuvah is so hard. We can't even necessarily agree on when teshuvah needs to be done. So where does the authority for that decision making lie, and how do we get to a point where we figure it out? Those are the questions for discussion. I'm going to send you into small groups so that everyone is a little bit put on the spot and has time to talk about it. If you get done discussing the discussion questions I put in the chat, then I'm going to encourage you to talk about your responses to the article I sent out. And I'm going to start with you having, let's see, 20 minutes. 20 minutes to discuss this discussion question. So, any last questions before you all go into your small groups? And I'm putting the discussion questions that you'll be discussing in the chat again so that you can see them. Welcome. No? Okay, I think you're good to go. Thanks all for coming tonight. And I'm gonna put you in your breakout rooms. Go ahead. Again. Welcome back, everyone. And apologies to those who found your thoughts cut off. If you didn't take time to thank your compadres, please do so now. You can send them direct chat messages, if nothing else. And I will take some time in a few minutes to turn off the recording for those who want to share without being recorded. But is there anyone who doesn't mind being on the record, sharing some of the insights or challenges that came up in your time together? Go ahead, Joy.
We had such a wonderful discussion. I was with Sharon and Ken. Thank you. I feel like I learned a lot from you. And we said so many great things. They did. I think, so I don't know if I'm getting too far ahead of us, but we talked about the article you sent out, and all three of us were able to read it, and we're very moved by it. And I personally, there's some things I think are missing from the context, but overall, we thought it was powerful and sad, and really appreciated reading it. And we came to this, and Sharon and Ken, please add to this if I'm missing something, but we said, until we tell the truth about the Nakba, until what has happened to the Palestinians, that's just what this book is about. We cannot heal, and we cannot be on the moral side. And I think that's all very important to us to be ethical, and for Jews to be ethical. So it was some very powerful, the article and what we all thought about it. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks for sharing. Right, I was thinking, I asked this question, what happens when we don't even agree if harm occurred? And I think it does come back to, I think I dropped in, I like to drop in on the different groups. And I think I dropped in on a group where someone was saying something about, just the temptation to just not focus so much on what happened, but focus on what needs to happen going forward, which is which is an urge I feel too. Like, oh God, we can get so bogged down in arguing about the past. And what is happening in the present is so terrible, but it's also true that that as long as we are disagreeing about how we got here, or not telling the truth about how we got here, we are not going to be able to have a morally accurate picture of what is possible and what is necessary going from here. So it's very challenging. Ken, go ahead. You're still muted right now.
Thank you. I think a huge problem is how many of us actually have contact with anybody that has different political views than us. It's fairly rare, I would imagine. I know it doesn't exist at all for me. But something that always influenced me was the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. And what Dale Carnegie said, the author of the book, was somebody's going off on you. Just sit there or stay there, watch them, listen, and let them say whatever they want. And by not interrupting them, by just listening, not challenging what they're saying, it builds intimacy with that person, which is the first hope you'll ever get anywhere with them. I'm not sure why that book didn't succeed more, but it was a big bestseller, but it's a great technique.
Right, a lot of people read the book and then did not follow the advice.
Yeah.
It is very hard. It's very hard to sit and accept critique and not interpret it as I'm bad, I'm bad. And that comes back to the first question Julie asked earlier of how do we learn to even be able to take in narratives that say, our ancestors did something harmful, our community did something harmful, the group that we are part of did something harmful, and not get bogged down in fighting off the narrative that somehow we are bad. Julie, go ahead.
And just to add to that, in terms of the Israel situation, we're also a minority that's despised already. So we're very defensive. I mean, I am, about when, Jews are doing bad things. I don't want the other, I want to say it, but I don't want to say it, in all groups. So it makes me dishonest, in spaces that I would share more of my critique, but it doesn't feel comfortable and safe to do it because I feel like I'm giving people ammunition to be anti-Semitic. We're all dealing with that, but it's, I also just wanted to say that I saw this really wonderful thing. I mean, maybe it wasn't as wonderful if I saw it now, but years ago I saw this thing called Shtetl, and it was a 3-hour documentary. Did anybody see this? So it was a shtetl in somewhere, Poland, and it had been a Jewish, 60-70% Jewish. Now there were no Jews, and there was a non-Jewish young man who was taking care of the graveyard, the Jewish graveyard. He had kind of a romanticized idea about Jews, and he was protecting the memory of the Jews. And then he met some Jews who began to teach him about the Holocaust. And he was very open, and he was really learning about it. And now we were going to have this young man who was going to become the mayor of this town, and he actually understood more about the Holocaust. And they brought him to Israel, and they brought him to Yad Vashem, and he just shut down. It was not a successful, ultimately was not a successful education experience, because I think what you were saying, Rabbi, about it's easier when everybody's dead, he's taking care of the cemetery. When there were live people who were saying what had actually happened in his town, when he got to that point, he didn't want to learn anymore. And so I've thought about that a lot, like in teaching, can you teach? Can you go too far in making people feel bad, and then they won't learn?
So the turning point was being in a Jewish culture.
Yeah. And I think he met Jewish youth, I think they came to his town. There was like much more, I can't really remember. It was like 25 years ago I saw this thing, but it was on, it's like this 3-hour long documentary about the and I remember being kind of like really mesmerized about it in terms of like how you do education that works.
Wow. Yeah, it reminds me of Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. Right. We tend to be more beloved too in places where there are very few of us left, and we can be an abstraction or a moral lesson. I also think that about
how do we protect ourselves when we're trying to educate ourselves to not shut down ourselves? If we are confronted by things that just feel too bad, there's a way we all shut off. And, what are the stimulants that make us shut off that we would be aware of?
Yeah, that is really the question. Because the question isn't how do we get other nations to do teshuvah? It's how do we ourselves get motivated to do teshuvah? Aruna Beth?
I was just thinking from our little group talk that it's traumatizing. If like, I know that as a white person, it's traumatizing for me sometimes to hear things that people like, you know, of my background, or, you know, it's just hard. I was talking about how when I first moved to Oregon and I found out that they didn't let Black people live here for a long, long time. That's why it was so white. You know, I came from the Bay Area I've been there. I'm not from there, but I came there after 20 years. And before that, I grew up outside of Detroit, Michigan, which is a whole nother planet. But the guilt and the shame, there's just so much trauma, I think, when you realize you're part of a group of people that has caused harm. And I don't know if it's just me because I'm so emotional and feel all the feelings, but it's a horrible feeling of shame and guilt. And even if you personally didn't do it, that people, you know, people that could have been your family or peers. And I think that's just what came to me, that I think it does cause pain, and nobody wants to deal with pain, including me. Sometimes I want to turn away from it. And so anyways, I was just thinking that it is an emotion, that it does affect people, even if you're the perpetrator or of a class or a group of people that were perpetrating, and you didn't do it personally. I think that it is the way we process them. You know, we don't have a healthy, in our world, a way to process these things. So I think that most people want to just avoid it, you know. So I mean, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think that I think that finding a process that would normalize what people would go through, the people who are oppressed and what they would go through in their process, and the people who maybe been part of a group of oppressors. And I know that there's people in Eugene who've been doing a lot of workshops around this, and privilege and this and stuff like, and I know that there's some young people who've been doing a lot of work around this. But just thinking that about that. And also the other thing is there's a lot of intersectionality. I don't know if that's the right word, but it made me about being women and dealing with men, and whether it's your culture or not. I mean, there's a whole big thing there. And so there's just so many things intercrossing of these situations. And yeah, I'm hoping we can make a better world and find how we can make a difference in our own lives. So
Yes.
it's just
Yes.
it's a little overwhelming.
It is overwhelming. I think about, well, you know, it's like, I don't know if she's so canceled that I'm not even allowed to mention her name right now, but J.K. Rowling's metaphor in the Harry Potter books of, speaking of someone who has done harm and experienced harm, of I don't know how many of you have read Harry Potter, but the final books especially have this conceit where the antagonist has done permanent damage to his own soul, and the only way that that damage could be repaired is through a process that is so painful that it's presumptively hopeless that he would go through it, because it is through the process of feeling remorse. And yeah, remorse is physically uncomfortable. I watch this with my children all the time. Like, we are not wired to be willing to feel remorse. It is not just emotionally uncomfortable, it is physically uncomfortable. It takes training to actually like sit with and work through remorse. And then we all have intersectional identities, right? We all, and I'm not using that term academically, I would say we are all agents of and targets of harm in our various multifaceted identities. And I think one way that many of us retreat into not doing teshuva is by retreating into our target identities to absolve ourselves of the ways in which we also are agents of harm. I think about this anecdote that Paul Kivel shares in his book, Undoing Racism, where he and another woman are like trying to facilitate a workshop on white privileged and white people's racism for a group of white people. And, someone says, well, I grew up poor, so I'm not really white. And someone else says, well, as a gay man, I don't really have white privilege either, and I don't identify as white. And, a few other people share their thoughts, and his facilitator looks at him and says, where did all the white people in the room go? And Paul says, well, don't ask me, I'm Jewish. And, but that's real. Like, it's a thing that many of us do. Ellen, you wanted to say something, and now you've taken down your hand, but I hope you still want to say something. So go ahead.
Go ahead, you can finish.
No, that was the whole thought.
Well, I had raised my hand when Beth was talking, and I didn't really have anything intelligent to say other than I was glad that someone that Beth mentioned shame and anger and grief and feelings. And the article that you sent out, was a great thing for us to read and to have to face all that. And I guess I just wanted to name what a terrible time this is and how emotionally difficult it is every day. And there doesn't seem to be any willingness. There doesn't seem to be much willingness that has any weight yet in Israel for remorse or empathy beyond both tribes are, pulled into their own grief. And then what was the last thing you were saying? Oh yeah. Yeah, and right, and we pull into our victim identity, like you called it, the target. And that's where it seems that so much of the conversation goes. And both, I met an activist on the West Bank who said that he was Palestinian, and he felt that the attachment of each people to the victim identity was what kept it all going. Like, and that just seems to continue to be like playing out every day in the discourse around the horrors that we're living through. But like I say, I don't have anything intelligent to say about it. Just I'm glad that somebody named that there is this, maelstrom of helplessness and futility and anger and shame and rage going on in me all
And
the time.
probably fear as well. I think threading the needle back to what I think Julie said about, feeling truly afraid and actually victimized right now as well. It's really hard to do teshuva if you think you're bad. And the Jewish people are being told all the time by all sorts of people that we are bad, right? That
But we
we are
are being
inherent,
bad, but we
right,
are, and so are they.
right. But also yeah, we have done bad things, right? But we have done bad things, and generations before us have done bad things. And just as we've talked about, right, like an ideal milieu for teshuva is to be able to separate the harm that has been done from the inherent core of who we are, like with a lot of compassion for us as a collective people. One thing that makes it really hard for the Jewish people to do teshuva for specific harms that we have done is the fact that there is so much anti-Semitism, so much narrative that we are inherently evil, that it becomes really hard. Like it's an incredibly sophisticated task to push against the narrative that we are inherently evil while also trying to acknowledge and repair specific harms that we have done. right? So like,
Well, in the,
it's really important to me to have a lot of compassion for us as a collective at how the world does not set us up for success.
I agree totally. And I mean, one of the, in the framework, in the restorative justice framework, when people are talking about, like, say, a local community context where somebody did harm, and one of the premises of that framework is someone is not going to want to feel remorse unless they feel like there's no motivation to do it, unless you feel like you are part of the community in which this harm was enacted, because you haven't harmed anyone in any meaningful way. You can't see that unless you feel like you're part of this community where the harm happened. And so the first thing to do is for somebody to feel like they belong, like somebody does care about them, even though they did harm. So I totally agree with you about that, and that it makes it, and that Jews in Israel are not going to be able to do teshuvah and recognize our harm unless we can feel that people do care about us.
It's recording again. So we can only do teshuvah. Like I've said this a bunch of times. I maybe said this in every class. We can only do our own teshuvah, right? We can't like do the hypothetical teshuvah that the person who is most agent, most on top of the world, the like cisgender, heterosexual, rich, white man who is the head of a corporation, right? Like whatever the thing is, right? Like most of us in the world are not that. Um, and I just said I just left out a whole bunch of identities, sorry. But we can only do our own teshuvah from like our own conflicting identity, traumatized by the harms we've received, traumatized by the harms we've inherited, people that we are. So for this next question, I'm going to say, feel free to refer to page 135 from the top of the page, 2 pages to 137 at the top, ending with to purchase the deed, or not, and take 10 minutes to discuss this question of like, not what's the teshuvah somebody else needs to do, right? Not what's the teshuvah that the US government needs to do, or that Israel needs to do, or that anti-Semites need to do. What's the teshuvah? What are the national harms that I believe everyone here is an American Jew, or if you engaged in those stupid conversations in the 1990s, perhaps you identify instead as a Jewish American. But that we or you are in an American Jewish household if you are not yourself Jewish. Sorry, noticing some of you who are exploring Judaism. That we and our own identities are complicit in, and what steps, including and beyond confession, are in our power to pursue towards repair. Okay, so that question is going in the chat. And I'm going to send you into breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to hear your brilliant thoughts before we close. Do you want the same rooms? I'm going to slightly mess them up. Just what has happened? Okay. I'm going to open all rooms and we'll figure it out. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to put in the chat a couple things. One, I did while you were in your groups, a little bit of research and found a brief NPR segment on the debate about land acknowledgements per Ellen's comment earlier. And I also looked up the the documentary that Julie was telling about Shtetl is available on YouTube in its entirety. In case anyone wants to, oh, oops, that wasn't Shtetl, that was a different article about land acknowledgements. Here's the documentary about Shtetl, in case anyone wants to get really depressed. Okay, so there are those resources, and we have a few minutes before closing. Oh, we have very few minutes. We really should be closing, but would anyone like to share a last few comments before we close?
I would. For anyone that did not read that article that the rabbi sent, it's one of the most profound article I've ever read, because his style is so clearly investigative reporting rather than taking a side and trying to justify his point of view. So I highly recommend that everybody read. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Rabbi.
You're welcome. And I want to say as a disclaimer, I didn't actually read it in full. Like I said, I really Googled, I forget what exactly I Googled, like nations doing teshuvah, and kind of hoping I would get like an interesting case of like a small country I hadn't heard of. And instead I got this argument and thought, okay, well, this hits close to home. So I'm glad it was provocative and made you think. Runa, go ahead. Runa Beth, go ahead.
Which article is this? I'm trying to remember if I read it or not. Which article you
I
talking about?
just sent it at 4 p.m. today.
Oh, that's no wonder I didn't read it. Okay, I was
Yeah,
busy.
no.
I was like, I don't remember getting
So
one.
yeah, I sent it to the whole class today, and if you didn't read it, no worries, but you should be able to find it. And if I didn't include you, please send me an email and I will share it. And I was just working with the email list that Jody used to cancel class last week. So if you got that email, you should have been included on this email. So we are individuals, and we're responsible for the individual harms that we do. And I think where this, as we continue to explore through this book, our embeddedness in larger and larger communities gets more complicated. And we are part of, not entirely responsible for, but implied, we could say, we are implicated in harms done by the nations to which we belong and by the ancestors from whom we descend. And I think this book and our discussion just continues to raise questions that ideally, if we want to be morally present people, we have to look at face on about what we do with those inheritances. So thanks for going there with me tonight, and I wish you a good evening.
Thanks.